The house in Back Bay was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of sleet against the mahogany frame windows. Ethan stood in the dim light of the walk-in closet, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the slick, heavy paper he had just pulled from the lining of Catherine's winter trench coat. The Archer Hotel. Room 412. 3 receipts, dated over the last 3 months, each for a Tuesday afternoon. The undeniable proof of a life she was living completely in the shadows. He inhaled the faint, lingering scent of her expensive jasmine perfume, now tainted by the sterile, metallic smell of a hotel room he had never seen. The woman sleeping down the hall, his elegant, perfect wife of 7 years, was a stranger. If you've ever felt the cold, hard floor drop out from beneath your feet, if you know the terrifying silence of a secret about to tear a family apart, stay with me. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the devastating price of the truths we hide. The house in Back Bay was a masterpiece of architectural silence. Its thick, century-old brick walls and double-pane glass kept the manic energy of Boston firmly at bay. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Thursday, and the only sound in the master suite was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique brass clock on the mantel. Ethan Clark stood in the center of the expansive walk-in closet, bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of the recessed lighting. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight as if the air had suddenly been sucked from the room. In his right hand, he held a small stack of slick, white thermal paper. He hadn't been looking for them. He had only been searching for the dry cleaning ticket for his navy suit, sliding his hand into the deep pockets of Catherine's Burberry trench coat. Instead, his fingers had brushed against the stiff, folded squares hidden in the very bottom of the silk lining. He stared at the black ink, the printed letters blurring and then snapping back into horrific focus. The Archer Hotel. Guest, Catherine Whitmore. Room 412, check-in, 2 p.m., check-out, 5 p.m. There were 3 of them, one from October 12th, one from November 9th. The last one was from just 2 days ago, Tuesday the 24th. Ethan's thumb ran over the embossed logo at the top of the receipt. The Archer was a boutique hotel on the edge of the financial district, discreet, expensive, with an underground parking garage that offered direct, unmonitored elevator access to the guest floors. It was not the kind of place you went to for a business lunch. It was the kind of place you went when you didn't want to be seen. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He looked up, his reflection catching in the full-length mirror attached to the closet door. He looked older than his 34 years, the lines around his eyes deepened by the sudden, crushing weight of reality. 3 hours, his mind supplied clinically. 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. Tuesday was Catherine's gallery day. She curated contemporary art for a private foundation, a job she loved because it gave her flexibility. She always told him Tuesdays were for studio visits in Cambridge, meeting eccentric artists over black coffee and evaluating canvases. He lifted the coat to his face, a pathetic, desperate reflex. He inhaled deeply. Beneath the familiar, comforting scent of her jasmine perfume and the crisp smell of the winter air, there was something else. The faint, sterile scent of industrialized bleach, hotel sheets, and underneath that, the faintest trace of a cologne that did not belong to him. Something sharp, pine and cedar. A sudden wave of nausea hit Ethan. He leaned against the mahogany shelving, squeezing his eyes shut. His wife, Catherine, the woman who had held his hand through his mother's funeral, who packed little handwritten notes into his briefcase, who slept just 30 feet away in their king-size bed, tangled in the high thread count sheets. He thought of her face that evening at dinner. She had been quiet, swirling her Cabernet, staring at the flicker of the dining room candle. When he asked her if she was okay, she had smiled, a perfect, practiced smile, and blamed the winter fatigue. She was lying. She had been lying for months. Ethan slowly folded the receipts, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy, like lead weights in his palm. He didn't scream. He didn't tear the closet apart. He simply stood in the silence, feeling the foundation of his 7-year marriage crumble to dust beneath his feet. He slipped the receipts into his own pocket. Tomorrow he wouldn't ask her about the studio visits. Tomorrow the hunt would begin. The morning sun broke through the heavy overcast sky, casting long, pale shadows across the dark oak floors of the kitchen. Ethan sat at the marble island, a mug of black coffee growing cold between his hands. He hadn't slept a single minute. The 3 receipts felt like a physical weight, safely tucked into the pocket of his tailored suit trousers. Soft, hesitant footsteps sounded on the carpeted stairs. Catherine appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a plush cream robe. Her dark hair was tousled, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, revealing faint purplish shadows beneath her eyes. For a fraction of a second, Ethan's heart betrayed him, leaping instinctively at the familiar sight of the woman he loved. Then the phantom smell of pine and cedar washed over his memory, anchoring him back to the agonizing present. "Morning," she murmured, her voice carrying a tired, gravelly edge. She moved past him, the hem of her robe brushing lightly against the back of his chair. Ethan forced his throat to work, his tone carefully neutral. "Morning, Kath." He watched her intently as she prepared her own coffee. 6 months ago, she would have leaned against his back, resting her chin on his shoulder, while the espresso machine whirred. Now she stood at the far end of the counter, her posture unnaturally rigid, her gaze fixed on the frost gathering at the edges of the window pane. The physical distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a gaping, unbridgeable chasm. In the cold light of day, Ethan began to catalog the subtle changes he had blindly attributed to the stress of her demanding career. He noticed the way she had stopped leaving her phone face up on the nightstand. He remembered the sudden, uncharacteristic flinches whenever a delivery truck rumbled past the house or when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. He recalled the hollow, vacant stares she would fall into during dinner, her mind 1,000 miles away from their conversations about his latest corporate acquisition at Ashford Media Group. A sudden, sharp vibration buzzed against the marble countertop. Catherine's phone lit up. Ethan's eyes snapped to the screen, but it was positioned just out of his line of sight. He saw Catherine's shoulders instantly tense. Her hand shot out, snatching the device with a quickness that bordered on panic. She didn't look at the message. Instead, she slipped the phone deeply into the pocket of her robe, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the fabric. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, his voice deceptively smooth, though a violent storm raged behind his ribs. Catherine offered a tight, fragile smile, turning her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Just the gallery. A shipping delay on the new contemporary pieces from Chicago. Nothing I can't handle." It was a seamless lie. It was delivered so effortlessly that it terrified him. If he confronted her right now, if he slammed the Archer Hotel receipts onto the counter and demanded an explanation, she would likely have another excuse ready. She would spin a web of logic, weaponizing his own trust against him, and he, desperate to salvage his reality, might just get caught in it. If he wanted the truth, the ugly, unvarnished reality of who she was spending 3 hours with in room 412, he could not afford to tip his hand. "Right," Ethan said, taking a slow, measured sip of his bitter coffee. "Don't work too hard today." "I won't," she replied softly, turning her attention back to the frozen window. Ethan stood up, grabbing his leather briefcase from the stool. He walked past his wife, the overwhelming urge to reach out and shake the truth out of her warring with the cold, calculating discipline of a man preparing for total war. He stepped out into the freezing Boston air, leaving the stifling silence of his beautiful home behind. The trusting husband was gone. The investigator had just clocked in. The glass-walled corner office at Ashford Media Group offered a panoramic view of the Boston skyline, a gray expanse of steel and frozen harbor. Usually this view grounded Ethan. Today it felt like a cage. He sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, his dual monitors glowing with acquisition spreadsheets that meant absolutely nothing to him. The door was locked. His assistant had been instructed to hold all calls. He pulled up his personal laptop, resting it atop a stack of quarterly reports. The cursor blinked on the login screen of their joint banking portal. For a long, suffocating moment, Ethan's hand hovered over the trackpad. This was the threshold. To cross it was to violate a sacred boundary of their marriage, to officially brand Catherine a suspect rather than a partner. But the memory of the Archer Hotel receipts, burning a hole in his suit jacket pocket, pushed him over the edge. He typed in the password. The joint checking and savings accounts yielded nothing unusual. Mortgage payments, private school tuition for Pinehurst Day School, grocery deliveries, and the usual luxury expenses. It was the picture of a stable, wealthy family. Ethan's jaw tightened. Catherine was too smart to leave a trail in their shared finances. He opened a new tab. He knew the password to her private account, a remnant from her days before the gallery, a small account she used for personal art purchases. She had given him the login years ago to fix a tax issue and probably forgot he still had it. He hit enter. The screen refreshed, displaying a ledger of transactions. Ethan leaned closer, the harsh blue light washing over his pale face. He pulled the 3 receipts from his pocket, laying them flat on the polished wood of his desk. October 12th, November 9th, November 24th. His index finger traced the screen, scrolling back through the weeks. On October 10th, 2 days before the first hotel visit, there was a withdrawal. Not a wire transfer, but a cash withdrawal from a teller at a branch in South Boston. A neighborhood Catherine had no reason to visit. The amount made his breath hitch. $5,000. He scrolled further down. November 7th, another cash withdrawal, same branch. $5,000. His heart hammered against his ribs in a frantic, hollow rhythm. He moved to the most recent date, November 22nd, $5,000. $15,000 in cold, untraceable cash over 3 months. Ethan stared at the numbers until they blurred. A physical sickness twisted in his gut, tasting like battery acid in the back of his throat. This wasn't just an affair. You didn't need $5,000 in cash every month to pay for a Tuesday afternoon at a boutique hotel. The receipts from the Archer only accounted for a few $100s each. The methodical nature of it all, the precise withdrawals exactly 48 hours before each hotel stay, painted a picture of a calculated, deeply entrenched double life. Catherine wasn't just slipping away for a romantic rendezvous. She was funding something, or someone. A chilling thought crept into his mind. Was she being blackmailed? Or was she keeping a lover who demanded a steep price for his silence? The image of his elegant, refined wife, handing over thick envelopes of cash in a sterile hotel room, made his blood run cold. Ethan closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. The silence of the office rushed back in, deafening and absolute. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and pressed his forehead against the freezing glass. Down below, the city moved on, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire reality had just been rewritten. He had the locations, the dates, and the amounts. Now he needed a face to attach to the betrayal. To get that, he would have to step out of the digital shadows and follow his wife into the real ones. The following Tuesday arrived with a bitter, biting wind that swept off the Charles River. Ethan sat slouched in the driver's seat of a rented gray sedan, parked half a block away from a discreet entrance in the South End. He had called in sick to Ashford Media Group, a rare occurrence in his 7-year tenure. His eyes, burning from days of fragmented sleep, were fixed intently on the rearview mirror. At precisely 2:15, Catherine emerged from a cab. She wore a dark wool coat, her collar turned up against the cold, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring her profile. She did not look like an art curator heading to a vibrant studio visit in Cambridge. She looked like a woman trying desperately to become invisible. Ethan shifted the car into drive, keeping a cautious, methodical distance as she walked briskly down the damp pavement. She did not head toward the Archer Hotel today. Instead, she turned down a narrow cobblestone alley and slipped beneath the unlit neon sign of the Blue Moon Bar. At this mid-afternoon hour, the jazz club was effectively a cave, dark, deserted, and completely off the radar of their usual social circles. Killing the engine, Ethan stepped out into the freezing drizzle. He pulled his coat collar high over his chin and approached the frosted glass windows of the establishment. The interior was swathed in heavy shadows and the muted amber glow of brass wall sconces. He found a vantage point near the side exit, peering through a narrow gap in the velvet drapes. Catherine was sitting in a booth at the very back. She had not ordered a drink. Her hands were clasped tightly on the scarred wooden table, her knuckles stark white. She was vibrating with a nervous, frantic energy that Ethan had never witnessed in their entire marriage. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door swung open. A man walked in. Ethan held his breath, his fingernails biting into his palms. The stranger was nothing like the refined, polished men of their corporate world. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered leather jacket and heavy boots that thudded dully against the floorboards. His face was rugged, hardened by elements Ethan could only guess at, with dark, unkempt hair and a sharp, calculating jawline. This was the man from the shadows. Ethan braced himself for the sickening blow of a lover's greeting. He expected a stolen kiss, a lingering touch of hands, a soft, intimate smile. He received none of it. The man slid into the booth opposite Catherine. He did not remove his coat. He leaned forward, his posture aggressive and demanding, dominating the small space. Catherine recoiled slightly, pressing her back against the worn leather of the seat. She looked utterly terrified. There was no romance in that booth. There was only pure, suffocating dread. Ethan watched, his brow furrowing in profound confusion, as Catherine reached into her designer handbag. Her movements were jerky, deeply reluctant. She pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope, the exact size to hold $5,000 in cash. She slid it slowly across the table. The man did not smile. He took the envelope, his large, rough hands effortlessly breaking the seal. He thumbed through the thick stack of bills right there in the open, his eyes never leaving Catherine's pale, stricken face. He said something low and sharp. Catherine swallowed hard, giving a single fragile nod. The interaction lasted less than 4 minutes. The man pocketed the money, stood up without a backward glance, and walked out of the bar, disappearing into the dense Boston fog. Catherine remained in the booth alone. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking in silent, agonizing sobs. Standing in the freezing rain, Ethan felt the ground shift violently beneath him. The narrative he had painstakingly built over the last week shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. His wife was not sleeping with that man. She was paying him. And judging by the absolute despair radiating from her trembling frame, she was paying a horrific price for a secret that was slowly destroying her from the inside out. The drive back to Back Bay was a blur of gray sleet and rhythmic windshield wipers. Ethan didn't remember navigating the winding streets or pulling his sedan into the heated garage. He only remembered the heavy, suffocating silence of his own home as he unlocked the front door. The house was empty. Catherine had texted him an hour ago. Another seamless lie about a delayed meeting with a gallery board member. He walked straight into his ground floor study, a room lined with dark mahogany bookshelves and smelling faintly of leather and old paper. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, he switched on the small brass reading lamp on his desk, casting a harsh, focused pool of yellow light onto the polished wood. Outside, the storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke. Freezing rain began to lash against the tall windows, a chaotic percussion that matched the violent tempo of his racing heart. Slowly, methodically, Ethan reached into his coat pocket. He was a corporate acquisitions executive. He dealt in leverage, in hostile takeovers, in presenting undeniable proof to corner an opponent. Tonight, his opponent was the woman he loved. He laid the 3 thermal receipts from the Archer Hotel in a neat horizontal row. Next to them, he placed his phone, the screen glowing brightly. On the display was a grainy, zoomed-in photograph he had taken through the velvet drapes of the Blue Moon Bar. It showed Catherine, her face pale and terrified, sliding a thick white envelope across the scarred wooden table to the rugged stranger in the leather jacket. Ethan poured himself a measure of neat scotch from the crystal decanter on his side table, but he didn't drink it. He simply held the heavy glass, letting the amber liquid catch the light. He looked at the evidence. It was a paltry collection of items, a few pieces of paper and a digital image. Yet they possessed enough destructive power to obliterate 7 years of history. He thought of their wedding day in Newport, the salt air tangling in Catherine's veil. He thought of the quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper in bed, the shared glances across crowded dinner parties, the comfortable, absolute certainty he had felt every time he looked at her. All of it felt like a sick, elaborate stage play now. The woman in the grainy photograph, paying off a thug in a dimly lit dive bar, was a stranger. And yet, a terrible gnawing confusion warred with his grief. If she wasn't sleeping with that man, what in God's name was she paying him for? What could Catherine, a woman who cried when she saw stray dogs in the rain, possibly have done to warrant a blackmailer. The fear on her face in the bar had been visceral. It hadn't been the fear of a cheating spouse getting caught. It had been the primal terror of a trapped animal. The distinct sound of the front door unlocking echoed down the hallway. Ethan froze. The heavy oak door clicked shut, followed by the soft, familiar rustle of Catherine taking off her damp winter coat. Her heels clicked softly against the hardwood floor, moving toward the kitchen. He set his glass of scotch down next to the receipts. His hands had finally stopped trembling. A cold, absolute numbness had settled over his nerves, a merciful anesthetic before the impending amputation. He picked up the 3 receipts and his phone, leaving the safety of his darkened study. It was time to burn the house down. Ethan's footsteps were completely silent against the Persian runner that stretched down the hallway. He moved like a ghost in his own home, the 3 thermal receipts and his smartphone clutched tightly in his hand. Outside, the storm had intensified. Rain battered against the tall, arched windows of the kitchen, creating a chaotic, deafening roar that mirrored the rushing blood in his ears. The kitchen was bathed in shadows, illuminated only by the faint, gray ambient light spilling from the street lamps through the rain-streaked glass. Ethan walked over to the expansive marble island in the center of the room. The stone was cold under his fingertips. With agonizing precision, he laid out the evidence. First, the receipt from October, then November. Finally, the one from just 2 days ago. Next to the neat row of paper, he placed his phone, ensuring the screen brightness was turned up. The grainy image of Catherine handing a thick envelope to the rugged stranger at the Blue Moon Bar glowed ominously in the dark. He did not sit. He stood on the opposite side of the island, his hands resting flat on the cool marble, waiting in the shadows. A moment later, the kitchen door swung open. Catherine stepped into the room, rubbing her temples. She let out a long, exhausted sigh, the kind that spoke of a bone-deep weariness. She reached out blindly and flicked the switch on the wall. The 3 pendant lights above the island flared to life, casting a stark, brilliant pool of light directly onto the white marble. Catherine stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes immediately dropped to the island, drawn by the stark contrast of the white paper against the dark veining of the stone. Ethan watched her gaze track from left to right. He watched her read the bold black ink of the Archer Hotel logo. He watched her eyes land on the glowing screen of his phone, capturing the exact moment her darkest secret had been immortalized in pixels. The physical transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The color drained from Catherine's face so rapidly that she appeared translucent, like a porcelain doll completely devoid of life. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The expensive leather handbag slipped from her slackened grip, hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud that echoed sharply beneath the sound of the rain. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes wide, wild, and entirely hollow. Ethan had rehearsed 100 different speeches in his study. He had prepared for her to cry, to deny, to beg for forgiveness, to weave another intricate lie about art dealers and eccentric clients. He was prepared for the defensive anger of a cornered cheater. He was not prepared for the absolute, paralyzing terror radiating from his wife. "I found them in your coat," Ethan said. His voice was unrecognizable to his own ears, a flat, deadened monotone that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "I thought you were sleeping with someone. I thought you were destroying our marriage for a few hours in a boutique hotel." Catherine's chest heaved. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, her hands trembling violently at her sides. She shook her head, a frantic, disjointed movement. Ethan tapped a finger on the glass of his phone screen, pointing at the man in the leather jacket. "I followed you today. I watched you hand him $5,000 in cash. I checked your private account, Catherine. $15,000 over the last 3 months." He leaned forward, the coldness in his chest expanding until he felt nothing but a freezing void. "Who is he? And what are you paying him for?" Catherine tried to speak. Her throat worked convulsively, but the words were trapped behind a wall of sheer panic. She looked at the receipts, then at the photo, and finally back at the man she had sworn to love and protect. A single tear broke free, carving a hot, shining path down her ashen cheek. She did not rush forward to hold him. She did not fall to her knees. Instead, Catherine reached behind her fingers blindly finding the deadbolt of the kitchen door. With a sharp metallic click, she locked it. The sharp metallic slide of the deadbolt echoed through the kitchen, a sound so terribly final that it made Ethan flinch. He watched in stunned silence as Catherine turned away from the locked door and walked deliberately toward the tall, arched windows overlooking the street. Her movements were no longer frantic. They were calculated, driven by a cold, mechanical survival instinct. She reached for the cords of the heavy Roman shades and pulled them down, plunging the room further into artificial isolation. Ethan's anger, which had been burning with a bright, consuming heat for days, suddenly faltered, replaced by a profound and chilling confusion. This was not the script he had prepared for. Cheating wives begged. They cried. They denied the evidence or threw themselves on the mercy of their betrayed husbands. They did not lock the doors and secure the perimeter like soldiers preparing for a siege. "What are you doing?" Ethan demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He pointed a trembling finger at the receipts on the marble island. "I asked you a question, Catherine. Who is he?" Catherine turned to face him. The ambient light from the pendant fixtures cast deep, exhausted shadows under her eyes. She looked at the receipts, then at the glowing screen of his phone, and finally at Ethan. When she spoke, her voice was stripped of all its usual warmth, reduced to a hollow, brittle reed. "You think I'm sleeping with him," she stated. It wasn't a question. It was a bleak observation, accompanied by a humorless, broken sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been choked with sobs. "You think I go to the Archer to have an affair?" 3 hours, Catherine, every month. $15,000 in cash. What else am I supposed to think? Ethan slammed his open palm against the marble. The loud crack made her flinch, but she did not retreat. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the island, stopping just out of his reach. She stared down at the grainy photograph of the man in the leather jacket. "His name is Derek Stone," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "He's not my lover, Ethan. He repulses me. He terrifies me." Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer conviction in her tone. "Then why? Why the hotel? Why the money?" "Because the Archer has an underground parking garage with an unmonitored service elevator," she explained, her words spilling out in a desperate, breathless rush. "Because room 412 is at the end of a blind corridor with no security cameras. It's a drop-off point, Ethan. A safe place to hand over the money where no one can trace us." The air in the kitchen seemed to grow heavy, pressing down on Ethan's chest until it was hard to breathe. The jealousy that had tormented him evaporated, leaving behind a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his bones. If she wasn't paying for an illicit romance, she was paying for something infinitely darker. "You're being blackmailed," Ethan said, the realization settling over him like a shroud. He looked at his beautiful, refined wife, trying to imagine what terrible secret she could possibly harbor. "Catherine, what did you do? What does he have on you?" Catherine slowly raised her eyes to meet his. The sorrow in her gaze was so immense, so agonizingly deep, that it made Ethan want to look away. She reached across the cold marble, her trembling fingers gently resting over his clenched fist. "I didn't do anything, Ethan," she whispered, a fresh tear sliding down her pale cheek. "I'm paying him for what you did." "What I did?" Ethan repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He pulled his hand back from hers as if she had physically burned him. The kitchen, with its gleaming surfaces and expensive appliances, suddenly felt like an interrogation room. "Catherine, you're not making any sense. What are you talking about?" Catherine wrapped her arms around her own waist, a defensive, fragile posture. She looked past him, her eyes fixing on the rain-streaked window, seeing a memory that Ethan had no part of. 5 years ago, she began, her voice barely a whisper against the drumming of the storm outside. "The Winter Gala at the museum in Cambridge. You had just closed the merger with the Sinclair Group. You were exhausted, Ethan, and you had too much champagne. Far too much." Ethan frowned, digging into the archives of his memory. He remembered the gala. He remembered the blinding flash of cameras, the heavy crystal glass in his hand, the intoxicating high of his first major corporate victory. He remembered the drive home, the slick roads, the blinding glare of oncoming headlights through the sleet. "I drove us back," Ethan said slowly, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "It was raining. I hit a pothole. Maybe a stray dog. I pulled over. I checked the fender. There was nothing there." Catherine squeezed her eyes shut. A ragged sob tore through her throat. "It wasn't a dog, Ethan, and it wasn't a pothole." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. "You got back in the car," Catherine continued, her voice trembling violently. "You said it was nothing. We drove home. You fell asleep the second your head hit the pillow. But I couldn't sleep. The sound of the impact, it kept echoing in my head. I took the keys to my car and drove back to Cambridge." Ethan gripped the edge of the marble island, his knuckles turning stark white. The world was tilting precariously on its axis. "Catherine, what did you find?" She looked at him then, and the sheer agony in her eyes broke whatever remained of his anger. "A man. He was in the ditch, Ethan, bleeding, unconscious. I panicked. I called an ambulance from a payphone. I waited until I heard the sirens, and then I ran. I came home. I washed the blood off the bumper of your car in the garage before the sun came up. I told myself he would live and that you would never have to know. You were about to be made senior vice president. I couldn't let you go to prison for an accident." Ethan felt his knees weaken. He sank onto one of the bar stools, staring at the receipts, the supposed proof of his wife's infidelity, with a sickening realization. They weren't love letters. They were ransom notes. "Derek Stone," Ethan breathed out, the name suddenly sounding like a death sentence. "He owns an auto body shop right across the street from where it happened," Catherine said, her tears falling freely now, splashing onto the polished marble. "He had a private security camera pointed at the intersection. It caught everything, the impact, your license plate, you stepping out of the car, stumbling, and driving away." "Oh, God," Ethan whispered, burying his face in his trembling hands. The paranoia of a betrayed husband vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, suffocating reality of a criminal. "He found me a month later," Catherine explained, her voice dropping to a hollow, defeated pitch. "He showed me the footage. He said if I didn't pay him an initial lump sum, he would take it to the police. And then, a year later, he came back. He needed more. $5,000 a month, or the tape goes to the district attorney. I sold my grandmother's jewelry. I siphoned cash from the gallery sales. I took the burden because I loved you, Ethan. I just wanted to protect you." Ethan looked at his wife, the woman he had accused of destroying their family just moments ago. She hadn't betrayed him. She had damned herself to a living hell to save his life, carrying the weight of his sins in absolute agonizing silence. And he had repaid her by hunting her down like a criminal. The receipts on the marble island no longer looked like evidence of a betrayal. To Ethan, they had suddenly transformed into a ledger of his own sins, paid for in installments with his wife's sanity. The storm outside battered the Back Bay townhouse with renewed ferocity, but the kitchen was trapped in an echoing, cavernous silence. Ethan slowly lowered his hands from his face. His fingers were numb, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked down at his palms, half expecting to see the phantom blood of a stranger he didn't even remember hitting. 5 years. For 5 years he had walked into the Ashford Media Group high-rise, closed multi-million-dollar deals, kissed his daughter goodnight, and slept soundly beside his wife, completely oblivious to the fact that he was a ghost walking among the living. His entire reality, his success, his freedom, his pristine reputation, was a carefully constructed illusion funded by Catherine's quiet terror. He looked across the kitchen at her. She was leaning heavily against the counter, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her. The sophisticated, untouchable art curator was gone. In her place was a woman who had been slowly bleeding out in the dark to keep him warm. The memories of that week, 5 years ago, began to reassemble themselves in his mind, the missing puzzle pieces snapping into place with sickening clarity. He remembered waking up the morning after the gala with a splitting headache. He remembered looking out the window and seeing his car parked perfectly in the driveway, completely clean. He had assumed the heavy rain had washed away the road salt. He hadn't known his wife had spent the dark, freezing hours of the early morning scrubbing the front bumper with a sponge and a bucket of bleach. shivering in her silk evening gown. "Why didn't you wake me up?" Ethan's voice cracked, sounding like tearing paper. "Why didn't you tell me that morning? We could have gone to the police. I could have faced it." Catherine shook her head slowly, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "You were on the verge of the partner track, Ethan. If you had a felony hit and run on your record, everything we had built, everything you had worked for, would have vanished. And the man, he lived. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU, but he lived. I tracked his recovery anonymously. When I knew he was going to survive, I thought I could just bury it. I thought I could carry it for both of us." "But you couldn't," Ethan whispered, closing the distance between them. He didn't reach out to touch her. He felt entirely unworthy of laying a hand on her. "Stone found you. He waited until the statute of limitations was almost up, and then he cornered me outside the gallery," Catherine said, her voice devoid of emotion, hollowed out by years of fear. "He showed me the video on a tablet. It's crystal clear, Ethan. You can see your face when you step out of the car. You can see the Ashford Media parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror. He knew exactly who we were." Ethan stared at the 3 thermal receipts from the Archer Hotel. $15,000 in 3 months. "How much have you paid him in total, Kath?" She closed her eyes. "Over the last 4 years? Almost $200,000. I emptied my inheritance. I sold the vintage Rolex you bought me for our anniversary and told you I lost it at a restaurant. I've been drowning, Ethan. I'm so tired of drowning." The dynamic of the room had inverted completely. Ethan was no longer the righteous, betrayed husband demanding answers. He was the architect of his wife's private hell. He finally reached out, his trembling fingers gently wrapping around her cold, delicate wrist. "I'm so sorry," he choked out, the tears he had held back for days finally spilling over his lashes. "I am so goddamn sorry I did this to you." Catherine didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into him either. The trauma she had endured alone had built an invisible wall of ice between them. "We have a problem, Ethan," she whispered, opening her eyes to look at him. "He said the 5,000 today wasn't enough anymore. He wants 50,000 by Friday, or he goes to the police." Ethan's jaw tightened. The corporate strategist within him, long buried under the shock, finally clawed its way to the surface. He looked at the glowing screen of his phone, at the photo of Derek Stone in the Blue Moon Bar. He was no longer fighting a phantom lover. He was fighting for his life. "He's not getting another dime," Ethan said softly, his voice hardening into cold steel. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent, synchronized panic. Ethan, accustomed to orchestrating multi-million-dollar acquisitions for Ashford Media Group, now found himself treating his own life like a hostile takeover. He cashed out his discrete stock portfolios, liquidated a private money market account, and authorized a heavy withdrawal against his own retirement funds. By Thursday evening, $50,000 in banded, unmarked $100 bills sat in a sleek black leather duffel bag on his study desk. But the true horror of those 2 days wasn't the frantic accumulation of cash. It was watching Catherine. Ethan had always believed that once a secret was exposed to the light, its power diminished. He thought that by sharing the burden, by taking the reins and promising to handle Derek Stone, he could bring his wife back from the edge. He was entirely wrong. The confession hadn't unburdened Catherine. It had merely broken the dam holding back 5 years of accumulated terror. She moved through the Back Bay townhouse like an apparition. She stopped going to the gallery. She stopped eating. When Ethan found her staring blankly at the frost-covered windows of the living room on Thursday night, the heavy bag resting on the floor beside him, he saw a woman completely hollowed out. "It's done," Ethan said gently, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. "I have the money. I'm meeting him tomorrow at the shipyard in South Boston. He brings the original hard drive and the cloud access codes. He gets the bag. It's over, Kath." Catherine didn't turn around. Her reflection in the dark glass was pale, her cheekbones sharp and pronounced. "It's never over, Ethan," she whispered. Her voice lacked any inflection, a dead, flat frequency that chilled him to the bone. "You think buying a piece of plastic erases what happened? You think giving him paper makes the blood wash out of the driveway?" Ethan stepped closer, his heart aching with a profound, useless guilt. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this. Together. I swear to you, No one is ever going to hurt you again. Catherine flinched violently at his touch. She pulled away, wrapping her arms around her chest, as if trying to hold her own ribcage together. She finally turned to look at him, and the absolute desolation in her eyes stopped the breath in his throat. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling, thick with unshed tears. "Every time I looked at you for the last 5 years, Ethan, every time you kissed me, every time we made love, every time you held our daughter, all I could see was that man bleeding in the snow. All I could hear was the sound of your bumper crushing his ribs. I didn't just hide your crime. I absorbed it. It rotted me from the inside out." Ethan stood frozen, the words hitting him with the force of physical blows. "I loved you enough to damn myself," Catherine continued, a solitary tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. "But I spent so long keeping you out of a cage that I built one for myself, and I don't know how to live outside of it anymore. I don't know who I am if I'm not protecting you from the dark." She walked past him, her footsteps light and completely devoid of energy, disappearing up the carpeted stairs into the shadows of the second floor. Ethan remained in the living room, staring down at the black duffel bag containing his salvation. He realized then, with a crushing, absolute certainty, that he had lost. He was going to buy his freedom tomorrow. He was going to ensure his career and his liberty remained intact. But the woman he had loved, the vibrant, brilliant curator he had married in Newport, was gone. She had died a slow, agonizing death over 1,000 Tuesday afternoons in room 412, and no amount of money could ever bring her back. The bitter wind whipped off the gray, churning waters of the South Boston shipyard, carrying the sharp scent of diesel fuel and freezing rain. Ethan stood beside the driver's side of his idling sedan, the collar of his wool overcoat turned up against the biting cold. In his right hand, he gripped the handle of the heavy black leather duffel bag. A battered, dark green pickup truck rolled into the deserted lot, its tires crunching loudly over the gravel and broken glass. It parked 20 yards away. Derek Stone stepped out, zipping his worn leather jacket. He looked exactly as he had in the dim lighting of the Blue Moon bar, imposing, arrogant, and dangerous. But as Ethan watched him approach, he felt no fear. The paralyzing guilt and confusion of the past few days had crystallized into a cold, lethal focus. He was no longer a husband uncovering an affair. He was a corporate predator protecting his final, bleeding asset. "Right on time, Clark," Stone sneered, stopping a few feet away. He glanced at the bag. "Your wife is usually the punctual one, and a lot easier to look at." Ethan didn't blink. He lifted the duffel and dropped it heavily onto the hood of his sedan. "Open it. Count it. Then give me the drive." Stone's smirk faltered slightly at the absolute absence of emotion in Ethan's voice. He stepped forward, unzipping the canvas. The neat stacks of banded $100 bills sat perfectly arranged. Stone reached into his jacket pocket and tossed a small, silver external hard drive onto the metal hood. "The original file, plus the cloud backup passwords written on the back," Stone said, his eyes lingering on the cash. "Pleasure doing business." "We are not doing business," Ethan stated, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He stepped around the hood, invading Stone's personal space. "You are taking a severance package. Let me be absolutely clear, Stone. I am not my wife. I don't operate out of fear. I operate out of leverage. If another frame of that video ever surfaces, if you ever come within 50 miles of Catherine again, I won't go to the police. I will use the private security contractors Ashford Media employs to handle corporate espionage. Men who make a very quiet living erasing pests like a mechanic from Cambridge. Do we have a clear understanding?" Stone looked into Ethan's eyes, searching for a bluff, but found only a vast, freezing emptiness. He swallowed hard, zipped the bag, and took a step back. "We're done here." Ethan watched the pickup truck speed out of the lot. He picked up the silver hard drive, placed it on the freezing asphalt, and brought the heel of his heavy leather shoe down on it, crushing the casing into jagged plastic shards. He kicked the debris off the edge of the pier, watching it sink into the dark, freezing water. He was free. An hour later, Ethan unlocked the front door of his Back Bay townhouse. The silence that greeted him was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It did not feel like a home that had just been saved from destruction. It felt like a mausoleum. He walked into the living room. The fireplace was unlit, the air inside noticeably colder than usual. Catherine was not waiting for him to celebrate their survival. There were no tears of relief, no desperate embraces. He stood alone in the center of the immaculate room, listening to the ticking of the antique brass clock, realizing with crushing clarity that he had successfully defended a fortress that had already burned to the ground from the inside. They had won the war against Derek Stone, but the casualties were total. 6 months had passed since the morning Ethan threw the shattered remains of a silver hard drive into the freezing waters of the Boston Harbor. Winter had thawed into a fragile, hesitant spring, but the ice inside the Back Bay townhouse had never melted. The silence that had once been a symptom of Catherine's hidden terror had morphed into a permanent, suffocating fixture. The secret was dead, but the marriage had been buried right alongside it. They sat at opposite ends of the long, custom-built mahogany dining table. The same table where they had hosted Thanksgiving dinners, where they had blown out candles on their daughter's birthday cakes, where they had toasted to Ethan's corporate promotions at Ashford Media Group. Today it held nothing but a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy, stark white paper. The afternoon light filtered through the arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the dead air. Ethan stared at the blue ink pen resting beside the signature line. He wore a simple gray sweater, the sharp, aggressive corporate armor of his tailored suits abandoned. He looked across the expanse of polished wood at Catherine. She was beautiful, as she always was, but the vibrant, passionate curator he had fallen in love with in Newport was a ghost. She wore a simple beige blouse, her dark hair pulled back loosely. The haunting, hollow look in her eyes from the agonizing days of Derek Stone had faded, replaced by a profound, quiet sorrow. She was no longer drowning, but she was entirely adrift. "The lawyers said we didn't have to do this together," Ethan said softly, his voice barely breaking the stillness of the room. "We could have just mailed them." Catherine offered a fragile, heartbreaking smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "After everything we've been through, Ethan, everything I hid from you, and everything you forgot, I thought we owed each other the honesty of an ending. Face to face." Ethan swallowed the heavy lump forming in his throat. He picked up the heavy brass pen. It felt like an anchor in his grip. He looked at the legal jargon, the cold, clinical dismantling of 7 years of shared history, of vows made in front of family and friends. He signed his name on the bottom line. The scratching of the nib against the paper sounded violently loud in the quiet room. He slid the documents across the smooth mahogany surface. Catherine looked down at the papers. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. For 5 years, she had forged a life of deception to protect this exact piece of paper, to protect the legal and spiritual bond they shared. She had sold her soul, emptying her inheritance and her sanity to keep the title of his wife. Now the threat was gone, but the cost of the ransom had bankrupted their capacity to love each other without looking over their shoulders. Every time they touched, the phantom memory of a bleeding man in the snow stood between them. A single heavy tear escaped her lashes. It fell, landing with a soft, devastating splash directly onto the thick paper, blurring the ink of Ethan's freshly signed name. She didn't wipe it away. With a slow, deliberate motion, Catherine signed her name next to his. It was a bitter victory. They had successfully outrun the law, outsmarted the blackmailer, and kept their daughter's life entirely intact. They had won, and they had lost absolutely everything that mattered. She placed the pen down and looked up at him, her eyes shining with the grief of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "We survived the fire, Ethan," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with the final, tragic acceptance of their shattered reality. "But the ashes left us with nothing to breathe."